I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Kelisha B. Graves, Chief Research, Education, and Programs Officer at the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change, as she discusses celebrating the King Center 55th anniversary through digital transformation of its rich archive and ongoing work to educate. Dr. Graves, welcome.
Thank you so much, David, for that wonderful introduction. And if you just give me a moment to get set up here, there's a phrase that David mentioned early in his introduction. I believe it was Zoomcades. And I love that term because what technology has allowed us to do is to be everywhere at once. And so indeed, I say good day to everyone who's attending this audience. I say good day because wherever you are in the world, I certainly hope that you are having a great day. As David mentioned, my name is Dr. Kelisha B. Graves. I serve as the Chief Research, Education, and Programs Officer at the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change in Atlanta, Georgia. I am so happy to be able to share at this conference. Just personally, I am a connoisseur of museums. And so to be able to be here and to share about our journey at the King Center is a wonderful experience. Certainly, let me start out by saying that on behalf of our CEO, Dr. Bernice A. King, we are most happy that the King Center has been invited to share in this great occasion with you. Furthermore, I want to start out by contextualizing what we exist to do at the King Center. Our vision is this. We envision a beloved community where injustice ceases and love prevails. And that vision is operationalized through our mission to empower people to create a just, humane, equitable, and peaceful world by applying Dr. King's philosophy and methodology of nonviolence, which at the King Center, we brand as Nonviolence 365. So as David mentioned, I serve as the Chief Research, Education, and Programs Officer at the King Center. And this behind me is an actual photo of our campus. And what that title means is that I get to work with a diverse group of people to design learning journeys for people all over the world. So at the King Center, just to kind of give you a conceptual high-level overview, I oversee 4 areas. We have the King Library and Archives area. We have our Nonviolence 365 Education and Training area. We also have our beloved Community Leadership Academy, as well as our Students with King area, which focuses on primary and secondary level programming for young people. However, we are here today to talk about the journey of the King Library and Archives. So this presentation I framed as our journey toward a single source of truth, because that's how I see our digital asset management journey, if you will. And so we're going to trace this journey through 3 key points. The first point is our origin story. So in other words, architecting and organizing a physical repository of cultural memory. How did we do that at the King Center? Next, I'm going to talk about our winning aspiration, thinking about the art of the possible. Each of the areas that I oversee at the King Center has what I call a winning aspiration. And so I'll be sharing that with you today. Furthermore, I'm going to talk about our digital transformation goal and understanding the value add of digital asset management. So firstly, our story. The Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change begins in the imagination, the powerful imagination, in fact, of a woman who believed that she could use her life for constructive social change. That woman is Mrs. Coretta Scott King, who we refer to as the architect of the King legacy. Now, traditionally, folks might understand Mrs. King to be the wife whom an assassin's bullet rendered unfairly alone at the prime of her life. Indeed, she was a young woman with 4 young children. That is the traditional mold. But at the King Center, we are on a mission to ensure that we set the narrative straight about who Mrs. Coretta Scott King was. She was indeed a mold breaker, a woman who deposited and who invested enormous amounts of energy and indefatigable passion into the institutionalization of the King legacy. The reason why we have the King Center today is because of the efforts of Mrs. Coretta Scott King. The reason why Martin Luther King Jr. is as revered as he is today is because of Mrs. Coretta Scott King. Also, Mrs. King was a trailblazer in terms of preservation efforts, particularly around the mid-20th century African-American experience through the particular prism of the civil rights movement, and we're going to talk about that today. Another point I want to make is that Mrs. King was very intentional, not only about establishing a record. Remember, the first part of this is talking about how we have established a physical repository of cultural memory. So Mrs. King's goal was not just to establish a physical repository, but to ensure that we set the record straight. The wonderful thing about technology is that I could transport myself back 60 years or so and put myself in the office of Martin Luther King Jr., Mrs. Coretta Scott King. So I think it's important that when we talk about setting the record straight, Mrs. King's efforts to do this began actually early in the 1950s, when she understood that it was necessary to pull together and to begin to collect Dr. King's speeches and writings. So if we look, I'll step off the stage here for just a moment. This is the timeline of the early establishment of the King Center. So the King Center, as was mentioned earlier, we're coming up on our 55th anniversary. So the King Center is established June 1968, and the Martin Luther King Library and the library documentation is the first element of the King Center, which starts in the library portion in July of 1968. But again, it's important to remember that it did not start in 68 in terms of cultural memory. That journey began in the 1950s when Mrs. King understood that she needed to preserve this critical moment in American history. As a matter of fact, Dr. King's first public speech as a leader in an official civil rights movement role was in 1955 during the Montgomery bus boycott, and he was elected as president of an organization called the Montgomery Improvement Association. And so he gives his first public address in this role at the Holt Street Baptist Church. During that time in 1955, Mrs. King was not able to attend that particular, what was called a mass meeting. So she arranged to have Dr. King's speech recorded. And so again, I think it's important that we recognize Mrs. King's efforts to establish and to begin to organize that physical repository of memory. And so the King Center's library documentation project grew out of the realization that the African-American experience in particular had often gone undocumented, that it had been incorrectly documented at times, undertold and underrepresented in the official narrative. So the goal of the project was to collect the documents related to the entire Black freedom struggle post 1964 and all of its historical and ideological manifestations. I think this is important that I want to share this from the statement of purpose for the Library Documentation Project, because this helps to understand the spirit and the thrust behind the King Library and Archive, the early iteration. So it says, we seek to gather documentary material on this period for more than ordinary scholarly purposes. We do this work out of the conviction that we who are Black must control and write our own history. We do it because we believe that we must understand both the glories and failures of the past in order to move into the next phase of struggle. We do it, of course, for the sake of our children, so that they may have some tangible evidence. Remember, we talked about that physical repository of cultural memory, so that our children would have some tangible evidence of the movement of their fathers. When we look at the King Library Documentation Project, a lot of the materials and assets of interest to the early documenters, I'm calling them, we have a great word cloud here: diaries and manuscripts and personal papers, letters, memoranda, photographs, records, again, establishing this physical repository of memory. But what was the overall impact of the King Library documentation project. This project under Mrs. King's leadership really sets the model for a lot of organizations that came after, but also the particular documentation strategies as it relates to the African American experience set a model. And because of that, we have today an enormous volume, as was stated earlier, the largest repository in the world of primary source material related to the American Civil Rights Movement under the leadership of Martin Luther King Jr. So today we have an enormous volume of content that enables us to think about a variety of educational and digital-based experiences that we can provide to the world. And so that moves us to my second point. What is our winning aspiration? So thinking about the art of the possible as it relates to the King Library and Archives. I've already stated that we have the largest repository in the world of primary source material related to the American Civil Rights Movement under the leadership of Martin Luther King Jr. And we have as our winning inspiration, we want to achieve global distinction as a premier research hub dedicated to the study of Martin Luther King Jr., Mrs. Coretta Scott King, and the American Civil Rights Movement. And so we have 5 overarching goals for the archive. Specifically today, I'll step off the stage here so all can see. We'll be referring to goal number 3, which I call Innovating for the Digital Future, and how we are approaching that project. So priority, innovating for the digital future. We have a lot of dreams and ambitions in terms of how we take the vast volume of material we have and make it accessible to the world for research and educational purposes. So that includes digitization efforts. And I'm even thinking about AI-powered systems and machine learning systems that can power reference and research demands. Also a front-end access point, so an online archive that would ensure that our collections can be accessible for research and scholarly purposes. So these are our bold ambitions, if you will. But as we started on this journey, we understood, or we learned rather, that it was necessary for us to approach the project, if you will, of implementing a digital asset management solution. And so that brings me to the third point in our story, our digital transformation. So how did we at the King Center come to learn about and appreciate the value add of a digital asset management system? So step up the stage briefly here so we can see the driving case for this, or what made us go DAM. So in the fall of 2021, we launched our audiovisual digitization project. And for us, there are 4 steps to our digitization efforts. So first, an inventory or a survey assessment. Phase 2, migration and digitization. Phase 3 is the preservation and access workflow. And then phase 4, rehousing and reprocessing. Of particular interest for this conference is the preservation and access workflow piece, which is where we found the need to implement a digital asset management system. Now, I must be honest and say that we actually launched our digitization project without even having a digital asset management system in place. And so it was a mad dash to try to find a solution to house these digital assets. So when we launched this project, there were several problems, or case problems, if you will, that we identified. First, we needed to rapidly preserve at-risk audiovisual materials. 2, there was a need to scale the accessibility of our collections for research and educational purposes. It's impossible to host at any one time 1,000 people in a physical archive. However, it is entirely possible for 1,000 people to access a digital archive. So central to our ambitions and our aspirations is to ensure that we can scale accessibility of our collections for research and scholarly purposes. But we did not have, when we started this project, a solution to be able to do that. 3, we did not have a digital source of truth for our archival collection or the broader or our broader institutional assets. So we recognized that we needed to have a single source of truth for these assets. And I'll explain more about that in a moment. Furthermore, an analog system does not immediately allow for quick searchability, and that limits impact potential. In a situation where we receive hundreds and thousands of research requests, it's nearly impossible to try to respond to all of those in a timely manner. So we learned that a digital asset management solution would enable us to be able to answer demands at scale, if you will. So in terms of digitization volume and scale, for our audiovisual digitization project, there's several formats. We had film, video, and audio. So in all, we have it's estimated around over 9,000 hours of audiovisual material. Furthermore, in terms of the volume, the data footprint, it's estimated that our audiovisual, at least for this pilot audiovisual project, we have over 366 terabytes of data. So we quickly learned that it was impossible to house 366 terabytes of data in a normal cloud-based solution like Dropbox or Google Drive. So we needed something a little more high-powered that would enable us to enhance searchability and all of the key points that I mentioned just a few moments ago. So achievement of our goals began with the rapid implementation of an Azure-based digital asset management system so that we could move from digitization to now housing these assets into a digital asset management solution and using that digital asset management solution as a foundation to power a collections engagement system. And I'm happy to say I'll be able to show all of you the initial output of that collections online engagement system in just a moment. And so walking this journey, if you will, from digitization now to a digital asset management solution to now this collections engagement system, and opens us to implement a variety of endless educational and scholarly based possibilities. So the value add of our digital asset management system, we needed to rapidly preserve at-risk audiovisual materials. Now, the DAM has enabled us to preserve in a digital format our at-risk audiovisual materials. We needed to scale accessibility for research and educational purposes. Our digital asset management system, in conjunction with the collections engagement system, will enable accessibility for research and educational purposes. Furthermore, we didn't have a single source of truth for our digital assets. And so now this digital asset management system establishes for us a single source of truth for archival assets and eventually for our broader institutional assets. Furthermore, an analog system does not immediately allow for quick searchability, et cetera. And so now the DAM has enabled us or will enable us to perform rapid searchability tasks in terms of assets and responding to requests. And part of this, we're working on firming up our metadata workflow. So ongoing efforts include standardizing metadata and ensuring that we have culturally responsive metadata. Culturally responsive metadata is highly important for cultural institutions, and that's something that we certainly recognize at the King Library and Archives. Furthermore, ongoing efforts include cascading access to the digital asset management system to the departments and working out how we manage that internally. Furthermore, there's a need to manage the data upload. The archive audiovisual project is only 366 terabytes, but there is an extraordinary amount of additional data. So we have to manage how we organize the workflow in terms of uploading data to the DAM. And then finally, our collections engagement system, which I'll show at the end of this presentation. And all of these combined efforts, the force of these combined efforts enables us to realize, again, endless impact possibilities. So a recap of our journey, we've discussed our origin story in terms of the King Library and Archives, which can be framed as architecting and organizing a physical repository of cultural memory. And then we talked about our winning aspiration at the King Library and Archives, thinking about the art of the possible. And finally, we discussed how we approached our digital transformation through the implementation of a digital asset management system and how we came to appreciate the value add of this kind of system. So the digital transformation of our archive and our ongoing mission to educate can be understood in two parts. First, the digital asset management piece, a digital repository preservation, facilitating digital access to our archival assets. Second part of that is the collections online system. And there's two parts to that. The first part of that system is a digital history timeline exhibition that I'll be showing you all in just a moment. And then we will also be building out an online archive that would provide enhanced access to our archival collections. Finally, I'll give everyone a moment to quickly scan this QR code. I am going to show all of you today the initial output of our digital asset management goals and our collections engagement system. So take a moment to scan the QR code, or you can simply go to timeline.thekingcenter.org. If you give me a moment here to transition, happy to share with the world the King Center's first online digital exhibition. And again, this collections engagement system is powered through our initial efforts through the digital asset management system. And what this exhibition does, it traces the history and impact of the King Center through the life of legacy of Mrs. Coretta Scott King. And so you'll see here, we have 5 periods of history that we go through, and for each period, you can unfurl the events, if you will, to see the various assets associated with that particular time period. So we are super excited about our first online exhibition, and we look to continue to launch more in the future. And so with that, I yield. Thank you so much for your attention. David, over to you.
Dr. Graves, what a delight. It's been so nice working with you along this project, and to welcome you today. We've had a few questions come in that we'll pass along and ask you to answer those later. For everyone who has the opportunity, the video that accompanied what would you say, kind of the lead up to ML King Day this year, called Dear Coretta, is just a heartwarming and moving and lovely video. It's available on YouTube, if I'm correct.
Yes, it is.
Dear
Coretta. Yes.
And maybe
and
we'll go ahead.
Yeah, if they attend the session later, I'll share all of the links to that.
That would be great. And we'll welcome you to be joining Neil Bilo in the tech track later today. Thank you. That's just what we wanted to help get this conference going.
Thank you.